This is the all-new MacBook Pro, and it's easily the most excited I've been about a new MacBook in years because this thing is a beast. Now, inside of the box, first thing we're presented with is the MacBook itself, and first impression here is it's heavier and thicker than any MacBook that's come out in the last few years, and it's actually for good reason, which we'll talk about more in a sec. But first, let's finish up with what's inside, where you get the all-new charging cable, your typical documentation, and the new and more powerful charging brick. Taking a closer look, what stands out here with the paperwork is this year, instead of the typical white Apple stickers, you're actually getting black ones, which is kind of cool. You've got the new 100-watt power brick that comes with this 14-inch model, but if you opt to go with the 16-inch model, you're actually getting a 140-watt brick to kind of make up for that laptop's bigger battery. But either way, it's a big step up from the 60-watt chargers that Apple used to include, meaning these new MacBook Pros are going to charge way faster. Of course, to connect the brick to the MacBook, we have the new nylon braided charging cable, which instead of using USB-C on both ends, the part that actually connects to the MacBook itself is using MagSafe, which I'm super happy to see back on the Mac. But it's time. Let's take a look at the MacBook Pro itself. And it's a beauty. It's a bit more squared off than the previous MacBooks. It's got this MacBook Pro logo that's etched in at the bottom. And while it is thicker and heavier than before, like I mentioned, I think it's for good reason, with Apple finally listening to its Pro users and bringing back some of the ports that they removed years ago. Not only do we have that MagSafe port again, which can help prevent damage to the port if you accidentally tug on it, but we also get a full-sized HDMI port again, and we even get an SD slot again. So that's 2 less dongles that you have to carry around with you if your workflow depends on those things. But even if it doesn't, you're still getting a headphone jack and 3 USB-C ports, which by the way can still be used for charging the MacBook if you don't want to carry around that new MagSafe cable. But opening it up, the next new thing is with the keyboard, which now has a black background to it, but more importantly, the touch bar that has been on the MacBooks since 2016 is gone, and instead, continuing the trend with bringing back old tech, Apple included a fully dedicated function row. Now, for some people, this may seem like a downgrade since the touch bar did look kinda cool, but personally, I think the touch bar was more of a gimmick than anything else, as you couldn't feel for the buttons since it was just a screen with no tactile feedback, and it made a lot of the things that you wanted to control just harder to get to. Whereas with this dedicated function row, everything you want is right there, it's quick, it's convenient, and I love it, especially with how good the key travel is with this keyboard. But moving on, the next new thing about the MacBook Pros is the display, which got a major upgrade. There's now significantly less bezel with the screens pushing out to the edges, which, yes, it brings the notch to the MacBook. Now, at first, it's kind of weird to see a notch on a laptop, but just like with the iPhone, you kind of quickly get used to it, and it isn't actually visible most of the time, especially if you're using dark mode. But the real benefit of the new display is actually twofold. For one, it's now a 120Hz ProMotion display, so things like scrolling and moving folders around is going to be buttery smooth, and two, it's using mini LED, which means you get way deeper blacks than the older MacBooks with higher peak brightness. So HDR content is just going to pop off the screen, and the display actually gets bright enough to where you can still make out what's on screen when you're outdoors and in sunlight. Of course, Apple had to match the new display with new speakers, which at least to my ears produce the best sound I've ever heard coming from a laptop. The sound is full, it's rich, and you can actually feel the air pumping out of the bottom grills when the bass drops. Now, under the hood, powering the new MacBooks are either the M1 Pro or the M1 Max chips, depending on how you spec it out, with the option to get it with up to 64GB of RAM and even up to 8TB of storage, although I think for most people that's more than overkill. We just got the 10-core M1 Pro here with 16GB of RAM, and even though it's not fully spec'd, everything just flies on it. Opening apps is nearly instant, and even putting it through a heavier workload like editing 8K footage in Adobe Premiere without proxies It handles it really well. But it's not just the power that makes the M1 Pro and the M1 Max special. It's also the power efficiency, with the battery life on this one being excellent. It just goes on and on and on, and combined with the 100-watt fast charging, I don't see myself ever running into a situation where this thing dies on me. So overall, I'm just really impressed with the whole system. The screen, the keyboard, the ports, how fast it's ready to go right when you open up the lid compared to the 5 or so seconds you had to wait with the older MacBooks, and the fact that they just don't get anywhere near as hot makes this my favorite laptop ever. And while it isn't cheap with it starting at $2,000 for the 14-inch model, it's at least worth considering if you're in the market for a high-end laptop.